Hello, this is Deb Wenger. Today we're going to talk about magazines, and you'll see here that I have an AARP magazine cover front and center with Johnny Depp, who has turned 50 years old. Yes, believe it or not. AARP, of course, stands for the American Association of Retired Persons, and it is the most widely circulated magazine in the U.S. So why is that? Because the magazine pretty much hunts down anybody who's 50 or older and makes sure that a copy of this magazine gets delivered to them. So if you are an AARP member, you get an automatic free subscription to this magazine. And so through that strategy, they've been able to distribute this magazine very, very widely. So let's talk a little bit about early magazines, definition of magazine, how we got to where we are today. So what is a magazine? Well, one definition from your text, it's a publication of lasting interest, so that's really key, targeted at a specific audience, including a collection of articles. So the idea of lasting interest is what differentiates it from a newspaper, let's say, which may also target a specific audience, a geographic audience, for example, and certainly also includes a collection of articles. Most often, I think, when we think about magazines, we think about printed magazines. However, there are, of course, online magazines as well. The first magazine to be published in the U.S. Rolled off the presses in 1741. Since then, there have been literally thousands and thousands of magazines published, but one of the first that was really widely known in the U.S. is the Saturday Evening Post, which was first published in 1821. So this became a truly national medium. It was rare to find a home in the U.S. with some discretionary income that did not subscribe to the Saturday Evening Post. This magazine contained essays, poetry, obits of famous people, and of course, something for the ladies, a little column called The Lady's Friend that provided information on childcare and fashion and household tips, that type of thing. And in fact, the Saturday Evening Post remained very important as a source of information across the country until television really displaced it. The Post was famous also for its covers, which were created by the artist Norman Rockwell. And you see here an example of one of his famous portraits for the cover. Magazines have had a significant impact in a lot of ways, one of which were really credited for the birth of photojournalism. This is a photo that was taken by Matthew Brady's Civil War photography team. Before this time period, photographs were, of course, much more rare than they are today. Very challenging to take and develop. You had to have expensive equipment and expertise. But during the Civil War, Harper's Weekly, an important magazine of that time, began to reproduce Brady's team's photo and really brought the war home to people all around the country for the first time. This was replicated to some extent by television during the Vietnam War. You've probably heard stories about how the video from the Vietnam War had a major impact in turning public opinion against the war. So it was because of magazines that photographs were believed to be great ways to document history, document and preserve history. And of course, that belief and that practice continues today. So what are the types of magazines that we want to focus on? Well, the first and most common, the one that you probably have consumed yourself, are consumer magazines. So these are magazines that target an audience that is believed to have very similar wants and desires like-minded consumers. So I use an example of Game Informer. This is a magazine that GameStop publishes that provides information about new games coming out or tricks and tips for playing games better. My son gets this magazine. So this is in one of the top 10 most widely circulated magazines in the U.S. Trade magazines, another common type of magazine. My dad was an attorney, so he got the magazine American Lawyer for many, many years. So this is a magazine that's published really for people who work in a particular industry or profession. Literary magazines, probably the least common of these three categories, but these are publications that focus on serious essays, publish short fiction. Oftentimes they have a political bent. I believe your text talks about the magazine The Nation, for example. That's an example of a literary magazine. Another thing that magazines are credited with is the idea of really promoting investigative journalism. You may have heard this expression before, muckrakers. So these were investigative journalists writing in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So what you see here is a picture of Ida Tarbell, who worked for McClure's magazine, which was a reform-oriented magazine with a goal of trying to uncover wrongdoing or to showcase the unethical practices of big business. And Ida Tarbell is credited with taking on Standard Oil. She was one of the most popular and widely recognized female investigative journalists of her time, working with a gentleman by the name of Lincoln Stevens to really take on corruption, wrongdoing, unethical practices in government and in business. So another major influential publisher of the early era of magazines is Henry Luce, who was the brains behind the Time Life company. So Luce developed the idea of Time magazine in the early 1920s with a college buddy. Basically, his idea was that they would present the week's news and put it in context. So it wasn't just, here's what happened, but here's why it happened, or here's how we can keep this from happening again in some cases. He was also responsible for founding Fortune magazine, which sort of took the same approach with business-related news. And also the brains behind Life magazine, which I would bet that your grandparents would talk to you about Life magazine and how excited people were to get their copies of Life magazine because they were able to really understand and view the news of the month through photos. We talked about the impact of photojournalists on the magazine industry and the magazine industry on photojournalism. Well, one of the first most widely recognized female photojournalists, Margaret Burke White, was a major contributor to Life magazine, was known for her willingness to go into dangerous situations and bring back compelling photos. So Time, of course, is still publishing and has a major impact to this day. The Person of the Year, this is the 2014 Person of the Year, was the Ebola fighters. People wait to see who is going to be on the cover of Time for their Person of the Year edition. So women's magazines, my guess is that if none of you have heard of any of the magazines that I've talked about up to this point, you have clearly run into a women's magazine at some point or another. And there are categories of women's magazines. So there are service magazines, and your text talks about the Seven Sisters, which would include like Good Housekeeping or Ladies' Home Journal. These magazines were designed to help women do things better, whether that's, cook healthier meals or, be healthier, raise your children better, that type of thing. Then there's that fashion, beauty, lifestyle category. Vogue magazine, one of the most widely recognized brands in terms of fashion around the world. And then there's the upstart Cosmopolitan, which really became a category of its own until several other magazines started to follow their approach. But the focus is on a single woman who is, interested in a career, interested in men. I defy you to find an issue ever of Cosmo that doesn't have the word sex on the front cover. So the whole purpose was to really say that women were independent, that women had their own lifestyle choices to make, and this was a magazine designed to provide them the information that they need to live the type of life that they want to choose. So not as many, but certainly a whole industry has been created around men's magazines as well. 1933 Esquire magazine, which would feature literature, pinups, which I'm not even sure how many of you might understand that term. So a pinup was basically a beautiful woman, maybe one page or maybe a double truck, so 2 pages, featuring a gorgeous woman that men would tear out of the magazine and pin up on the wall in their office or the wall in their bedroom. So Esquire was known for its pinups, as well as articles about men's fashions. Again, not as many of these magazines as for women. By 1953, society was ready for something a little racier for men, and Playboy was first published, with first issue featuring a nude Marilyn Monroe centerfold. By 1993, there was the U.S. edition of Maxim, and this took Playboy a little bit further, including more articles about sex, sports, humor, as the editor says, really is designed to get at that inner guy in just about every male. Magazines, however, have been criticized for promoting a negative body image, particularly for women. So critics have charged that magazines and the ads within them use excessively thin female models that give the average woman a negative body image, that impossibly thin, you'll hear that term, so that real women, quote unquote, don't look like that. The criticism has had an impact, and you will see that magazines now do occasionally feature differently sized women in the photos that get included. So there is some sensitivity to the fact that not every woman is going to be able to be a size 0. And there's now evidence that men are suffering from body image issues. It has a name. It's called six-pack stress. And, Men's Health, which the title would suggest that they're promoting healthy perceptions of what you look like as well as physical health, is a big-time offender when it comes to really publishing what some might say is an unrealistic ideal of what a man's body should look like. AOL and the Today Show did a survey of men and really revealed some, what I thought were a little bit startling responses, that more than half of men say they feel unsure about their appearance at least once a week. Almost 2/3 say they always feel like they could lose weight. More than 1/3 worry that people judge them on their appearance, and a little bit more than that are uncomfortable wearing swim trunks. So we may see this same evolution of the models and the ads appearing in men's magazines as well. Another area where magazines have been criticized is in the area of the covers that they tend to use and the people that they consider to important enough to put on the cover are rarely non-white. So a study done in 2002 found that only 20% of magazine covers feature people of color. I do think that that is evolving. However, as of 2011, Sports Illustrated still had featured only 2 women of color ever for their swimsuit issue. Still, there are signs. Michelle Obama certainly has been featured many, many times on magazine covers. Teen music magazines, another example where we're seeing non-whites appearing on the cover. And I think as our country's demographics change, as we grow more diverse, I think that we will probably see this issue diminish. So media literacy, of course, is a big part of what we try to promote in this class, and we need to talk a little bit about advertising and editorial control as it relates to media literacy. So there's long been a conflict between those responsible for advertising and those responsible for the editorial content. So an advertiser, somebody who is planning to advertise in a magazine, is unlikely to want to put their ads into a magazine that has content that might be critical of their product, right? So if you are doing a story about all dishwashing liquids are exactly the same, that there's really no benefit to Dawn over Joy, so you should buy the cheapest one. Well, is Dawn likely to want to buy an ad in a magazine that has an article about that? So there's always been this tension. Now, magazines have long also talked about kind of a synergy that exists between magazines, models, and sponsors. So it's not unusual in a fashion magazine to see a article that talks about what's hot in fashion, and then 2 pages later you see an ad for one of the companies that, oh, amazingly had a product that was included under what's hot in fashion. So all of this is kind of blurring the lines between ads and editorial content. Is really what the magazine is saying what's hot, is it really hot? Or did Gucci just buy a big time ad in the magazine, and so obviously Gucci products are going to be hot? This is an idea that's influencing other media as well, the concept of native advertising. So ads made to look like magazine content. So it's a little bit different than what I just talked about with, a Gucci product figuring on the What's Hot page. This would be if Gucci actually commissioned an article about fashion for the magazine. So here's an example in Forbes. Fidelity, which is a big financial advising company, wrote an article or commissioned to have an article written about whether you should accept your employer's pension buyout offer. And so this content was created by an advertiser. It's clearly marked as such, but critics say you've gone too far with native advertising. When you actually have an advertiser contributing content, then you've stepped over the line. But if you look at surveys of consumers, what they're saying is if this information is actually very credible and still offers good advice and isn't all about trying to sell Fidelity products, which this particular article wasn't, then that's okay. We just want good information. And as long as you tell us where that information comes from, we're comfortable with that. But native advertising is a concern. And if you do any reading about the industry, this is really a hot topic right now. So magazines, of course, are living in a digital age just like we are. Some magazines have gone to digital-only publication. At Time, all of its titles basically allow you both a print subscription and an online or digital subscription, whether that's the app or the website or whatever. So if you buy one subscription to Time Magazine, you also have access to Time.com and to the Time iPad app. Your text talks about the Atlantic in particular. So it was a magazine that was being hit pretty hard by the digital boom. Made some adjustments in how they publish. They put things out digitally first, and that has led to some real success for them in terms of the magazine is still being published, but their digital first strategy has helped them monetarily. So what are some trends in magazine publishing? Well, one is that they are targeting narrower audiences. So, one of the magazines that gets joked about often is Cat Fancy. So you don't get Cat Fancy unless you are crazy about cats. In addition, presentation now matters more than anything. We've talked a couple of times about how much more visual our society has become. So layout, graphics, photos, magazines tend to be getting more and more visual. And to some extent, articles in many publications are being shortened a bit. People, you'll get arguments about whether people have shorter attention spans now or not. But the fact of the matter is that it's more rare to see really lengthy 3,000 word magazine articles than it has been in the past. So before you take your quiz, which will be on Blackboard, you're going to want to watch a video with someone who is actually mentioned in the magazine chapter. Dr. Samir Husni, I don't know if any of you noticed him quoted in the text, but he is considered one of the most widely recognized experts on the magazine industry in the US and perhaps even in the world. So he calls himself Mr. Magazine. I encourage you to watch the video interview where we talk about sort of successful magazine strategies and the industry as a whole. Suggest that you watch that video before you take your quiz because there will be at least a couple of questions from that interview included in the quiz.